To my right stood 5 rabbis, and to my left stood 5 more. Now, many of you know that I'm not striving for humility when I say that singing is not the strong suit of my rabbinate. Yet that's what we were doing. We were singing, and we were singing loudly. Hine matov, lo yisagoy oseh shalom, words of joy, words of peace, words to sanctify the kadosh, the holy and set-apart nature of that day, as loudly as we could. I wish that we were standing straight and tall, arm in arm, because of Prophet Amos's call to let justice roll down like waters. I wish it was because of his exhortation to establish justice in our gates, and perhaps on a deeper level we were. But the more proximate cause of our open circle of singing rabbis was the gentleman, and I use that term very loosely, standing a mere 18 inches behind me with a personal public address system spewing hate speech. We were all standing before the Supreme Court on the day that oral arguments were heard in the case of Abergefell v. Hodges, which finally extended to gays and lesbians the protection of the 14th Amendment, to marry those whom they love and to protect the families they are raising. There were thousands of people before the highest court in the land that day, and the air was festive, despite those visibly and audibly on the wrong side of history. People worked pretty hard for that day. We worked pretty hard here too, didn't we? And people turned out in great number to show their support for equal protection under the law, including our semicircle of progressive rabbis. As our voices were growing hoarse, we were rescued by a sweet sound to our left. The Washington, D.C. Gay Men's Chorus was leading all of those in earshot in the national anthem and in a beautiful rendition of We Shall Overcome. These words, somehow capturing both the depth of human struggle and the bending arc of history toward justice, rang out from the crowd in a voice more powerful than a group of singing rabbis I'm in could ever carry. Goosebumps prickled my arms as I realized that We Shall Overcome someday might be today for millions of Americans. With a big smile on my face, I prepared to leave the crowd. As I was turning, I overheard a black woman talking to her friend. Both were dressed in bright colors and holding rainbow signs, but neither of them were smiling. How do they miss the irony, she asked, of singing this song when blacks are dying 30 miles from here? How do they miss the irony, she asked, of singing We Shall Overcome when blacks are dying in Baltimore? I haven't slept the same since. On the same day, the Supreme Court was hearing oral arguments, if you'll remember. The city of Baltimore was in upheaval over more than the death of Freddie Gray, a black man who died in police custody. Long simmering racial tensions boiled over in a night of looting and burning, injury and anger. And there I stood in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, singing about the civil rights issue of my time with a song appropriated from the civil rights issue, a fight for equality and justice that is still yet to materialize. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s sought to change the starkly unequal world of disenfranchisement, segregation and oppression, including racially inspired violence experienced by the African American community. And one only need open their newspaper. One only need open their Facebook feed. One need only open their eyes to see that that struggle is ongoing to this day. One need only look into America's prisons, where people of color are so disproportionately incarcerated that 1 in 3 black men can expect to go to jail in their lifetimes, a system Michelle Alexander effectively argues has become the new Jim Crow. One need only look into their child's schools, where few black faces exist because schools nationwide are more segregated now than they were in 1970, and because black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than white students for the exact same behavior. One need only look into America's funeral homes, where memorial services for Freddie Gray, Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, and so many more remind us that the disenfranchisement, the segregation, and the oppression of the Black community continues unabated. Bryan Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative and the author of a book, Just Mercy, which simply has to be the next book that you read, posits that we need a new conversation about race in America. The real tragedy of slavery, he says, was not involuntary servitude. It was not forced labor, he said, but rather the ideology and the narrative of racial difference that we created to legitimate the institution of slavery. We created a narrative about race that allows racists to sleep at night and to attend their church or synagogue the next morning. It's a narrative about race that the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, or the Voting Rights Act, or affirmative action, or body cameras can't even begin to touch. For all of these are attempts to treat symptoms rather than the disease. Race is the child of racism, not its parent, and the narrative that we've created around race continues to fester unchallenged in this country. In a speech he gave to the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, Stevenson pointed out that in Germany today, and I quote, "You can't go to Berlin without seeing the markers and the monuments and the stones that force you to think about the families that were abducted and taken to the camps. They want you to go through the concentration camps," he says, "and reflect soberly on the Holocaust. It's important and it's necessary as a society tries to come to terms with its past behavior and to change its ways. Yet we do the opposite in this country," he says. "You say the word race, and everyone starts looking for the exit. Nobody wants to talk about the ways this narrative has to change. This narrative has to change, and this change will begin with us." In the 1950s and 60s, necessary change did start with us. Jews were instrumental in fighting discrimination because our history is the history of being a stranger in a strange land. We worked to secure federally protected basic rights for the African American community because we knew the experience of being a persecuted minority, from Roman times to recent Seattle memory, when Jews were excluded from country clubs, from neighborhoods, from universities. We were strangers in the land of Egypt. We were strangers in this land. And we used the relative power of our post-war position to benefit those who were equally excluded. Arnold Aronson, a Jewish leader, co-founded the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, lobbying for and winning the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and organizing the March on Washington. The Leadership Conference met in the offices of the Religious Action Center on Reform Judaism. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were drafted there. Rabbi and scholar Abraham Joshua Heschel marched arm in arm with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma. And when other religious organizations caved to pressure in 1961, Temple de Hirsch and many of you in this room tonight allowed him, you stepped forward to host one of his 3 speeches. Necessary change did start with us. As a prophet Amos exhorted, justice was found in our gates. And these changes tried to alleviate some of the symptoms of inequality before the law. We fought for change. Yet we were treating symptoms rather than the disease. The disease, the destructive narrative on race that condones racism, continues unabated in American life and even within the Jewish community. Ta-Nehisi Coates, a journalist with The Atlantic and the author of Between the World and Me, writes of a black dream unattainable for black America. Unattainable for black America. It is, he writes, perfect houses with nice lawns. It is Memorial Day cookouts, block associations, driveways. The dream is tree houses and Cub Scouts. The dream smells like peppermint but tastes like strawberry shortcake. And for so long, he writes, I've wanted to escape into the dream. But this has never been an option because the dream rests on our backs. In his eyes, the American dream rests on the backs of the Black community. In my eyes, so does the Jewish community. This is our history with racial inequality. This is our narrative. And we must talk honestly about this history so that change will one day again start with us. Allow me to explain. The New York Times, the reading of which, especially when accompanied by a bagel and lox on a Sunday morning, is now a better litmus test of Jewish identity than synagogue attendance ever is. The New York Times had this to say about Jews in 1893, and I quote, about Jews. The neighborhood where these people live is the eyesore of New York, and perhaps the filthiest place on the Western continent. It's impossible for a Christian to live there because he will be driven out either by blows or by dirt and stench. Cleanliness is an unknown quality to these people. They cannot be lifted to a higher place because they don't want to be. We, the Jewish community, who knows the experience of being persecuted for physical difference and for cultural uniqueness, we chose to tell ourselves a Jewish Horatio Alger story, a narrative of the Jewish community pulling itself up by its bootstraps. Karen Brodkin, professor of anthropology at UCLA and author of How the Jews Became White, writes that part of her Jewish ethnic heritage was the belief that Jews were smart and that our success was due to our own efforts and abilities, reinforced by a culture that valued sticking together, hard work, education, and deferred gratification. Don't get me wrong, these abilities, these ideas do and did contribute to Jews' upward social mobility. But, as Professor Brodkin argues, that alone is insufficient to account for Jewish success. Jews excelled at university because they were smart. Jews excelled at university because they were excluded from the clubs and social gatherings that Protestants went to college for. Jews became doctors and lawyers and pharmacists through their work ethic. Jews became doctors and lawyers and pharmacists because they could rely on other equally excluded Jews as their sole clientele. Jews scrimped and saved and delayed gratification to send their kids to college so they could live a better life. The GI Bill gave Jewish children a better life. The Jewish narrative that Jews are smart and that our success was due only to our own efforts and abilities only tells part of this story. The other part of the story is that we stood and that we continue to stand on Black backs while reaching for the next rung of the American social ladder. Jews were promoted in systems of industrial capitalism, in steelwork and manufacturing, faster than Blacks or Asians or Italians, because while the Jewish community wasn't considered white, we were whiter than they were. Jews became white because there existed a people called Black. On census surveys, Jews ceased to mark their ethnic origins and began to mark Caucasian. Jews' names changed so that we could pass as white. The rate of college attendance and professional jobs skyrocketed in the Jewish community after World War II, courtesy of the GI Bill, an affirmative action program for white males functionally withheld from Blacks because colleges and labor were still segregated. Mortgage tax credits, predatory lending, residential segregation at large district elections, preferences for children of alumni, Washington State's most regressive in the nation tax code. All of these allow the Jewish community to keep reaching for the sky while pushing off on those not similarly advantaged, driving them further into the ground. We stand on Black backs when we reach for the dream. This is the other part of our narrative. This is our history with racial inequality. When we refuse to acknowledge it, we perpetuate and we indeed further the narrative of racism that exists in this country. The rarely spoken but often felt enduring discrimination of the Jewish community is the sense that if we lifted ourselves up by our bootstraps, why can't they? If we overcame oppression to be successful, if we looked out for our own, why can't they? I remind you, the New York Times in 1893 said of the Jews, they cannot be lifted to a higher place because they don't want to be. How dare we? How dare we, who have overcome the social barriers to our success, not only by the works of our hands, but by a shifting definition of race that makes us whiter than somebody else? How dare we say this of others? How dare we empathize with African Americans, claiming to know the plight of the stranger while continuing to benefit from the racist policies that oppress them? How dare we? This is the change that we have to make, and this change will start with us. Here I need to acknowledge two things. First, I recognize that the Jewish community is not homogeneous, that there are black Jews that I am honored to call co-religionists. Electing a black president didn't mean the end of racism in America, and having black Jews part of the Jewish community doesn't absolve us of our moral obligations. Second, while the moral path seems obvious, it's not going to be easy. I wouldn't label myself a racist, nor would I accept that definition of any of you. Yet we don't have to be actively racist for racism to persist in an era of supposedly colorblind America. It has taken a structural form that's far more difficult to excise. The call to action with this sermon is as diverse as the congregation that is hopefully hearing it. Some of us are leaders in business and industry. Some of us are thought leaders or elected officials. Some of us are teachers or public safety officers. Some of us are involved in parent-teacher organizations or homeowner associations. Some of us are parents, and all of us have a role to play, a unique role in ending the starkly unequal world of disenfranchisement, segregation, and oppression still experienced by the African American community. There are no signs that say blacks aren't welcome here, yet lending practices and steering minorities to certain neighborhoods ensure that our neighborhoods remain effectively segregated. Driving while black is not a punishable offense, yet stop and search practices, racial profiling, and violence during arrest disproportionately affect the black community. Shotgun diplomacy at the voting booth no longer exists, but racial gerrymandering, at-large elections, and voter identification laws ensure blacks are not fairly represented in our democracy. These are the challenges we face. We're not racist, yet racism persists, and we have a change to make, a change that will start with us. As part of a Jewish community that has known success in American life far beyond our own efforts and abilities, and that continues to be inspired by our prophetic vision to establish equality and justice, we have a responsibility to find a way to apply our unique position, our unique talents, our unique interests to this struggle. We know from discrimination, and we have an obligation, each and every one of us, to find a way to use our success and our power to change the narrative of race in this country. To my right stood 5 rabbis, and to my left stood 5 more. While there was a more proximate cause for our circle of song, Amos's call to let justice roll down like waters, his exhortation to establish justice and the gates course through our veins and through our voices. These voices were drowned out by the overwhelming bigotry that we heard and were trying to overcome until we were rescued by the Gay Men's Choir of Washington, D.C. As they were singing, "We Shall Overcome," while African Americans were literally dying in Baltimore, I realized just how wrong I was. Peggy McIntosh's invisible backpack of privileges enjoyed by the white community is as relevant today as when she wrote it. I appropriated, I used, I used that language to win the civil rights issue of my time while failing to work to complete the civil rights issue, a struggle existing to this day, a fight for equality and justice that still has yet to materialize. So here I stand again. To my right sit hundreds of friends. To my left sit hundreds more. With your help, we won't be drowned out by bigotry. We will all work to overcome. You joined me in the fight for marriage equality, and we won. I hope you'll consider joining me again.